אחר צהריים טובים. שמי אפרים קם, ואני התבקשתי לפתוח את המושב המעניין הזה וגם לסיים אותו. וברשותכם אני רוצה לעבור לעברית מסיבה אחת בלבד, מפני שעברית היא שפה קצרה יותר מאשר האנגלית, וניתן להביע את אותו משפט בעברית במספר מילים מועט יותר מאשר באנגלית, ולכן זו דרך מצוינת לחסוך זמן. אז בבקשה לעברית. This session is supposed to talk about superpowers in the Middle East, and we must say that since the Second World War, two things have changed in the power of the superpowers. The first began in the mid-1950s when the two European superpowers that controlled the Middle East for many years had left the center stage and went to the back stage and left it to the United States and the USSR. And the second was in the mid-1970s to 1980s when the USSR went down. Once in 1974 when it lost its biggest asset in the Middle East, which was Egypt, and the second time was at the end of the 1980s when the USSR actually disintegrated. And again, the United States became the only superpower both in the world and in the Middle East. And in this session, we would like to look at the possibility of perhaps another change in the next 2 decades, and I'm saying this for three main reasons. The first reason is the United States. The United States is now forced to cope increasingly with difficult problems in the Middle East and also with failures. The Palestinian problem, the United States has yet to resolve this issue. The Iranian issue, a lot has been talked about this, and the difficulty to keep everyone satisfied. The United States has put the boots on the ground both in Afghanistan and in Iraq and has not really succeeded. The United States is now forced to grapple with ISIS, which is a very difficult campaign, a complex campaign, and it's very difficult to see if it's successful. Its policy vis-à-vis Syria over the last 2 years has zigzagged, and the most prominent countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel, are criticizing its conduct. So the question is, will the United States decide to lower its profile in the Middle East and focus on other problems? The other reason is Russia. Russia in 2015 is not Russia in 1990 after the USSR was disintegrated. Russia now has a different policy than the West and the United States in a series of problems, such as the Syrian one, the Iranian one, and also vis-à-vis perhaps Egypt. And please make note, President Putin visited Egypt last week. I don't remember how many times the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah Sisi has met with Obama. I'm not sure if he has ever met with Obama. But Sisi, over the last year, has been in Moscow twice, and now Putin went to Egypt. The ministers of foreign affairs and of defense in Russia came to Egypt, and they have a big nuclear deal now, and also maybe a bigger weapons deal. So is Russia perhaps trying to go back to the position that the USSR used to have in the past, the Soviet Union? And the third reason is China and India, two superpowers who are most interested in the Middle East economically. And the question is their economic power, especially China's, will motivate them in future to play a bigger role, to be bigger leaders in the Middle East based on their economic capabilities? In order to look at these issues, we have asked 4 experts here. I'm not going to read out the bios that you have in your booklets. I'm only going to tell you that with us we have Ambassador Dennis Ross. You saw him this morning. Dennis has filled many roles in the American administration, and now he's coming here from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm sorry, I assumed that they have interpretation. So I will now end with what I have said. So as I've said, Dennis Ross, the Russian representative is now was recruited at the last minute. That is the Chancellor Alexey Drobinin. We also have Dr. Christina Lin, who came from the Center for Transatlantic Relations, and we have Mr. Vikram Sood, an observer from the Observer Research Foundation in India. We are now being moderated by Nadav Eyal. You know him from Channel 10 News. Whoever watches it sees him once and again. Nadav Eyal is I'll be sitting here, and Nadav will now moderate.
The opening statement by Ephraim was in Hebrew, and I see that you didn't have any way to get the translation. So I'll make it really short. The Middle East is changing. The United States, which since World War II, and especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, has became, as Madeleine Albright put it at the time, an indispensable nation. She said it, of course, generally, but you can say it about the Middle East specifically after 1990, is, at least it seems, losing some of its grip in the region. It has fought a war which it has not completely won. It has left Iraq. And the question at hand is, do we have here a situation in which new and old powers are influencing more and more the Middle East, and what, of course, are the consequences for the stability in the region, and including specific issues like the war in Syria and Iran. So we have a very short amount of time. We're going to make the most of it, try to make the most of it. And I want to open with you, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and ask you about the relationship between Israel and the United States, which are at focus, of course, of the news right now. But is it possible, do you think, that Israel and the United States are now experiencing a situation in which Israel might need to pivot itself, or is pivoting itself, from its close relationship with its strategic alliance with the United States, or this is a quarrel within the family, with its friends, and Israel actually has no option? And if Israel has no option, is it the same for the US in this region?
I think that's an intriguing question. I was going to start by saying I hadn't noticed there were any troubles between the US and Israel, but look, I would say the following. I've heard in the past when people would say, well, maybe Israel will pivot away from the US, I would say pivot to who? There is one country in the world that Israel can count on, not only from a security standpoint, from a political standpoint. Who stands with Israel when it comes to the UN or in all the international forum? There isn't anybody else who's going to be able to play that role. The nature of the security relationship, the strategic relationship, it's fundamental. Now, the fact is, one of the reasons that we have a special relationship is because there are shared interests, shared values, and shared threats. And I don't see that changing. There is there's tension in the relationship right now. We can obviously talk about that. Do I think it's going to affect the fundamentals? No.
It's not?
I don't think it's going to affect the fundamentals.
It's not a sort of a lowest point ever that might actually make Israel a partisan issue in the United States, thus actually influencing the strategic relationship? This is the risk, isn't it?
Well, look, if Israel becomes a partisan issue, well, yes, then it's going to change the character of the relationship. What has always served Israel well is that it's not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue, it's an American issue. If Israel is transformed into a partisan issue, particularly at a time when, within 20 years, the United States will be a minority-majority country. You look at the percentage of Hispanics, Asian Americans, African Americans, they will come to be a majority within the country. These are not communities that historically have had a connection to Israel. Doesn't mean they can't have.
Yep.
In fact, it should be a reminder that from an Israeli standpoint, you reach out to these communities, but it should also be a reminder that one of the great strengths that Israel has always had is that it is a democratic country in a region that is characterized by non-democracies, in a region that today looks even less certain than before, in a region where Israel stands out because it is a country that's ruled by law. It is a country that has not only regular elections, but oftentimes more frequently scheduled elections than one might otherwise imagine, where the loser accepts the outcome in elections, where the political space here, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a dynamic culture. Listening to Amos Oz this morning speak about, you know, the character of Israel's culture and the dynamism of it. Here is a country where women's rights are respected, where gay rights are respected. Nowhere else in the region is that going to be the case. Those are attributes for Israel that make it a certainty to maintain a relationship with the United States and should be, again, a major source of appeal to these elements within, these minorities within the United States who may not have had that historical relationship. But becoming a partisan issue in that kind of a context, that's the last thing that Israel needs.
But, okay, but we have seen that it is happening, at least the incidents that we're actually talking about without talking about yet, which is the speech of the Prime Minister. And you started making the case for it as a partisan issue, talking about those new communities in the United States, which are not attached to Israel, and then you sort of you talked about the Israeli society, and everything is, of course, true, but we do see in the Democratic caucus, as we see in the polls, that something is changing, is shifting in the U.S.
Well, it's a reminder that Israel obviously needs to continue to elevate its democratic values. It's a reminder that on issues like the peace issue, even if the Palestinians are not going to be responsive, it is enormously in Israel's interest, not only because of the delegitimization movement internationally, it's enormously in Israel's interest to take initiatives, to demonstrate that, in fact, if peace doesn't come, it's not because Israel isn't prepared to act. And that is important also, I think, in the states, as the states undergo certain kinds of changes. But I'm trying to come back to the essence of the first part of your question. I don't see that Israel has an alternative. And when the United States looks at this region and looks at all the uncertainty in this region, it also needs to have a country that it's always been able to count on, and that's Israel. And that, I also think, is something that with all the different turmoil, I still think that is a pillar upon which you rest this relationship.
Okay, we're going to return to the speech issue and to Iran. So I'm not going to let you off the hook so easily about that.
But as shocking as that might be.
Yeah, well, I'm a journalist. I won't be doing my job here. You say, you know, they told me, get the headline. I want to turn to Deputy Ambassador Drobinin. I just asked Dennis Ross about the relationship between Israel and the United States, and I'm wondering, how do you see, for instance, the way in which Russia has played its cards in reference to the Syrian civil war? And I should state right in the beginning that here in this country we had a defense minister that predicted that in a few months President Assad won't be there, and Israel positioned itself at the time as completely opposed to the Russian view in that sense, and sort of predicting that the West and the United States would be right in their assessment that it's a done deal, that the regime is over. And of course, Russia held a completely different view, and to a large extent, it turned out, in various aspects, even right. So is this a victory, what's happening in the civil war in Syria right now? The fact that Assad is still there for Russian policy in the Middle East?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this important and distinguished forum. It's a great pleasure to sit here and to be able to lay out the Russian official position on very important issues. I think you understand that my disadvantage is that I am an official and you are experts. All my colleagues here on the panel are experts.
That makes you all the more interesting.
So they are freer in expressing their views than I am. But anyway, I will try to answer your question. First of all, I would like to say that it's a kind of a complementary question. It's easy to answer this question and to say that, well, Russia was right from the very beginning in not focusing specifically on the figure of the Syrian president and speaking more broadly about about reasons of the civil conflict that started to play out in Syria in 2011. So, but you know, we are here trying to engage in a very serious discussion, so I will not call it a victory for Russia, because we have never seen this situation as a lose-win situation. I would say that what we have experienced over the last 3 years in Syria is a very tragic development of events. What we have right now is a very complicated, difficult situation on the ground when we have a central government beleaguered and opposed by a vast array of irregular groups, some of them affiliated with most extremist forces, which have put their force on display over the last months, not only in Syria, but also in Iraq, in Libya quite recently. So what we have now is a very, very complicated situation. In Russia, we see it as a serious security challenge because, this situation gives a very propitious breeding ground for the recruitment of violent extremists, and not only in Syria or in the Middle East, but also, in Europe, in Russia, even in China. And, there are some cases of people coming all the way to Syria from the United States and then back to the United States. Yes. So this is a difficult situation. What we say right now, because I think it is the most important thing, is that we still need to take a closer look at the role that the Syrian government is playing in all of this. We do, as Russia, we do not try to, to absolve the Syrian government of some, very cruel actions, to put it diplomatically, that it has undertaken against some parts of its own population over the years, but still we do have to recognize that this is a regime that is supported by a large part of the Syrian population, that it is a government that has been fighting extremist forces, probably alone in that region for quite a while now. And I think the guiding line for the continuation of possible common efforts in this arena was stressed by leaders of the G8 countries last year in Northern Ireland,
now
when
the
they
G7,
called.
right?
Sorry?
It's less than a G8 right now.
You can say it like that, right? That will be quite.
But let me interrupt you.
But just to finish my words, the leaders at that time joined their hands in declaring that it is important for the government of Syria and the opposition forces to fight the extremist groups together. Probably this is a guiding line that we need to take into account going forward.
Okay, let me put to you sort of a general analysis, which I think is the general analysis today, beyond the substantive arguments you just made about the regime itself, recognizing, quite frankly, as you did, the atrocities that it is responsible for. Russia, led by President Putin, would not allow, after the Libyan affair, for this region, again, for a possible client state, an important client state, and a state that had relationship with Moscow, to fall again into the sphere of Western influence through civil war. It would do anything in its power, including shipments of weapons, of course, using its veto power and every aspect of power, in order to make sure that this regime would not change if there would be not sort of a Russian agreement with Western countries about what will happen afterwards. And Russia is aiming at, again, having much more influence in the Middle East, somewhat as it had 30 or 40 years ago. How would you react to that, Francis?
Well, I think I don't want to argue with you that Russia wants to have influence in the Middle East. It's only natural for a country of Russia's size and economic and political clout to have influence in a region which has, which it has, had a lot of presence over the last, let's say, 2 centuries. It's only natural. But what I will argue against is, trying to draw in parallels to what Russia is trying to do in the region now and what the Soviet Union did. Because, the situation is completely different. Russia does not try to impose its ideology on governments that it is dealing with. What we are trying to do in the Middle East right now is trying, first of all, to preserve the respect for international law. We are trying to engage with legitimate governments. And what we are trying to do is trying to support them in their fight, legitimate fight, against extremist forces which are threatening the stability in the region. Okay. So there is a kind of a sea of difference between what the Soviet Union did and what Russia is doing.
I'm going to talk, let's talk a bit later about the rivalry or the possible rivalry with other powers, but I want to turn to you, Mr. Sood, and talk a bit about India. I think I should congratulate you because I read somewhere that India has surpassed China in terms of growth this month. I think India is right now growing faster than China is.
That's myself.
Is it because India is doing so good, or is it because China is slowing down?
I think it's a bit of both.
Yes. In this region, India, of course, always had a strong connection to the Middle East through trade and otherwise. But we're talking about new powers, which are actually old civilizations which held, in terms of trade, in terms of in product, were leading the world until, a glimpse of an eye in history. How do you see the position of India in this new Middle East in which one superpower has no ability to dictate outcomes?
That is part of the problem really today, because we all know the kind of situation that prevails in the Middle East, and I think there are 4 or 5, as I look at it, 4 or 5 regional players now. One is CENTCOM, one is ISIS,
yeah.
One is Israel, of course. One is these monarchies that are in league with ISIS or supporting them. And then there is Iran.
Mr. Sood, can you use the mic?
And then there is Iran, which is the other big player. How it works out in the end, I don't know. But for us, the Middle East has always been important. And when I say always, I mean last few decades, is the energy. 60% we take in from the Middle East. It'll probably go up to 90% as our economy grows, and that's one huge chunk. And we have 7 million workers in the Middle East, primarily in the Gulf. They, along with the other 7, 8 million or 10 million other workers abroad send in $71 to $72 billion as remittances, mostly from the Gulf. Well, that's a huge chunk for a country like ours.
Yep.
And that weighs in considerably in our actions with the Middle East. I mean, imagine if in today's condition, our workers could be held hostage in huge numbers. And do we have the ability? Does anyone have the ability to get them off? So we are circumscribed by this kind of.
Let's take one issue, for instance. Let's take one issue and focus on the Indian position towards that issue because it's of interest to the audience and to Israel. The Iranian issue. Iran and India, of course, have a relationship, a civilization relationship that goes thousands of years, and of course there's a relationship vis-a-vis energy, and there's the whole issue of a nuclear Iran. For us, it's the prime. For us here in Israel, it's a prime issue. How do you analyze it from an Indian point of view?
First of all, I think let me tell you, the Indian point of view is that we are against proliferation. No weapons. But Iran has the right to nuclear power for electricity. But no weapons. And initially there was reluctance in India to go along with the sanctions. But we have reduced our intake of energy from Iran from our 11%, which was there earlier, to about 6% now. And I think the United States now understands that below this would hurt our economy even much more. So,
was it because of pressure from the United States, of course, on the sanctions?
We wanted to be part of this system that
pressures Iran to
pressurize Iran to the policy that you enunciated. So that is as far as we can go for sanctions.
If negotiations fail now,
sorry?
If negotiations will fail now, a country like India that needs the energy, what would India do? The P5 plan +1 fails. There is no process for the time being, and India has to take a decision. Does it, go on and starts buying oil from Iran in the same rate that it did?
We'll have to go and look for oil elsewhere too.
Yeah.
We can't be seen as somebody not following the international agreements on issues like this. So there has to be for us it's a problem if there is no solution. If there is no solution to the P5 +1 and Iran, and it breaks down, then there is a problem for us.
Ms. Lee, in a sense, an elephant in the room is China, and it's a big elephant. China, of course, will become the world's largest economy in a few years now. From what you see, from what you hear, what are the ambitions in this region? Are the ambitions purely economic, infrastructure, energy? Do they focus on spheres of influence? Sometimes you need to secure these spheres of security influence in order to make sure that your energy routes and other interests, which are commercial, are protected. How do you see the strategy, the Chinese strategy now?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank INSS and General Udi Jekyll for inviting me to come and speak about China. It's really an honor to be here. You're right. China's interest in the Middle East is primarily driven by energy security, just like India, and ties in with a lot of what Mr. Sood said. And I also concur with Ambassador Ross that there's no substitute or alternative for U.S. role in the Middle East. Although, we could have additional partners. I think there will be less freedom of action for the U.S. First of all, I'm an American.
Yes, of course.
Not speaking for the Chinese.
Well, I'm asking you as a Chinese expert.
I think U.S. will continue to play a vital role and be an ally for Israel in this region, but perhaps have less freedom of action as extra-regional powers like China or India or Russia enter the security scene. So I think that it's important for us to figure out ways to partner together for regional stability. It shouldn't be, mutually exclusive. China is a unique global actor. It is not yet a global power like the US, but nonetheless it is a global actor with global interests. So it's driven to be more proactive, take a greater geopolitical role in the Middle East by three core interests. First of all is energy security, that ties into economic growth that sustains the communist regime's legitimacy and survival. Secondly is territorial integrity, to garner support from the Muslim world for the One China policy, and that Xinjiang is a part of China, not East Turkestan. Tied into that is internal stability. Stability, you hear the Chinese talk about stability all the time. Weiwen, maintain stability. That's very important for the Chinese because they see the Middle East as a forward front to combat Islamic extremism and terrorism, much like what Americans and Europeans are doing right now to deter attacks against Xinjiang. So let me explain a bit more. On energy security, after the Arab Spring, China was caught completely flat-footed, and they lost $20 billion overnight. In OPEC member Libya had to evacuate 36,000 Chinese nationals. So their main concern in this region is to deter another Libya, to protect their investments and protect their citizens, like what Indians are doing. China has over, you guys have 7 million. China has about 1 million in the Middle East and Africa. So we see that China has become more proactive in the region. They used to have this non-interference policy, but now they've become more proactive with 4 UN Security Council vetoes on Syria. They've conducted gunboat diplomacy off the Syrian coast with Russia last year and another war game planned this spring. They conducted naval war games with Iranian Navy in the Persian Gulf in September, and they also deployed their attack submarine for the first time.
Let me interrupt you because the examples that you just brought, in the eyes of a Western Hemisphere country, which Israel is right now, maybe it should pivot differently to eastwards. I don't know. I'm going to ask you that question, but it's very it's very worrying because if China and Russia are cooperating together, possibly with Syria or with Iran, these countries are, of course, countries which are enemies of Israel. Should we see it in that way? Should we interpret the way that the Chinese are working here as building an alliance which will be built against a possible American hegemony in this region?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an alliance. I mean, it's sort of strategic partnership. They have aligned interests, China and Russia, regarding Syria. And I'll explain why Syria is important to the Chinese and why they're drawing a red line there. I know French people don't like Americans to use the word red line, but in this case, I'm talking about Chinese red line. Okay. This is tied to Xinjiang. Why does China support Assad? It's not to counter U.S. or to counterbalance U.S. hegemony. It's driven by self-interest, and Western press, largely ignore Xinjiang or views it from a strictly human rights perspective.
Maybe you should explain to the audience Xinjiang.
Xinjiang is the westernmost Muslim province of China, and it's just humongous. It's a centerpiece of Xi Jinping's foreign policy, which is the Silk Road economic belt. And it's huge. It's 1/6 the entire landmass of China, 3 times the size of France, borders 8 countries, including Russia, India, Afghanistan, Pakistan. It is a site of strategic mineral reserves like coal and oil, and it also houses China's nuclear warheads. So if we are concerned about Pakistan and Syria being failing states and having terrorists access loose nukes and WMD, China's equally concerned about instability in Xinjiang and terrorists accessing China's nuclear warheads. There are nuclear tunnels under Urumqi, which is the capital, and the site of the 2009 Xinjiang uprising. Yep. So this is a serious concern that Western press largely ignores. And Xinjiang stability is tied to China's energy security because a lot of the overland energy supply from the Caspian Sea region and increasingly from the Persian Gulf traverse Xinjiang onto the rest of China.
So let me try to follow suit with your ideas. What you're saying is that the Syrian stability and fighting against what Beijing sees as Islamic extremism is important because the way it might influence or project itself back into China mainland. And right. That's the reason why they would want a Russian or a Russian-led policy in Syria to triumph in the end, in the form of President Assad's, staying in power. I'm oversimplifying, but...
Yes, I don't know if they're looking at a Russian-led foreign policy. If this is just strictly from a Chinese perspective, from their interests, they don't necessarily support Assad, but it's friendly, to the Chinese, and they're worried about, who's going to replace Assad. If it's ISIS or some Sunni, Islamist regime that's going to be sympathetic towards the Uyghurs and radicalize, Chinese Muslims. There are over 20 million Sunni Muslims in Xinjiang. So they're worried about homegrown radicalization and, some Sunni Islamist regime in Syria that's going to export terrorism back to China. So that's how they're looking at this. This is tied to counterterrorism. And actually, it shouldn't be a zero-sum game. I mean, they can actually cooperate, and they ask for cooperation with the Israelis on counterterrorism. This is becoming a very large foreign policy issue for Xi Jinping, and some counterterror experts actually predict that counterterrorism is going to be the primary focus of Xi Jinping's leadership, as much as it was for President George W. Bush. And most Westerners don't know this, but the Pentagon always focuses on China's military, its defense budget.
Yeah.
But China's internal state security budget has been greater than its defense budget every year since 2009 Xinjiang uprising. So maintaining stability is very important for the Chinese, much more so than the Western Pacific.
I'm sort of interrupting you because I know that Mr. Sood has a comment over here.
Actually, this is for Christina. Great power and empty spaces. The United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan, so there's an empty space there. They're unpopular Americans today, unpopular on the streets in Pakistan. They have no presence in Iran. I think China sees this as an opportunity. It has already become the largest embassy in Islamabad, for instance. That's a small indicator.
That's a message for you guys, right?
and it has a lot of infrastructure plans going on. Is China going to use Russia as the front for increasing its presence in the Middle East?
Its political presence, you mean?
Not military presence, economic infrastructure presence with security provided by somebody else.
That's a question I would like to hear Dennis Ross' take on it, and then Vice Ambassador Drobinin about the question you just raised. First of all, about the analysis you just heard from the three persons to your right-hand side, about the way that the United States is perceived. I know that Americans don't like to hear the term empire, but a sort of a redrawing empire, I'm using this term anyway, a redrawing empire in the region, and what it means for stability in the region and for the rise of new and old powers in the region. And then I would want to hear you, Vice Ambassador.
I think it's very easy to follow into conventional wisdoms. When it comes to the use of military power, who's carrying out a large number of air sorties every day in this region? I don't think it's Russia. I don't think it's China. I know it's not India. I think it's the United States. When one sort of talks about the decline of American power, what it reflects right now is a perception that the United States is not as active as it has been, is not as effective as it has been in the past, and that there are seemingly greater uncertainties in the region. It isn't that other powers are suddenly coming in to take the place, because they aren't. And by the way, your explanation about China's interest here, China is not a military power in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Russia is not a military power in the Middle East. It is actively supporting Assad in military materiel, and the question becomes: is this region, which, interesting enough, as you listen to the different commentaries, all three of the other panelists so far have focused very heavily on the issue of counterterror. which could be a point of great converging interests among us, we see within this region right now a divide between radical Islamists and non-Islamists. And the radical Islamists, by the way, are radical Sunnis, which cause great concern to the Chinese. They are also radical Shia. I mean, the fact is, Hezbollah is a radical Shia group. Kutayb Hezbollah in Iraq the same, Asayb al-Haq the same, the Badr Brigades the same within Iraq. They may be fighting each other, and there is some question these days about exactly where is the U.S.
Oh, I was going to interrupt you about that, because the Israeli standpoint towards this issue is, of course, that the U.S. is having more than a flirt with the Iranians, not on the nuclear issue, but in terms of its relationship towards the Syrian civil war. And even there were some publications about some sort of Hezbollah through Iranian eyes, I don't want to say coordination, but there were statements made in this country in relationship to this. And Israel, of course, sees Shia radicalism as strategically even more dangerous than Sunni radicalism.
That may be, except that if Israel was completely preoccupied with Shia radicalism, its approach towards Syria might have been different than it has been. Israel has not, even though there were certainly some within Israel who looked at what was going on in Syria and saw it as a chance to change the balance of power against Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria. That has not been the Israeli position. Israel has stayed out, for the most part, has sought to stay out of that conflict until very recently.
Or followed suit with the U.S. policy. When Barak said he's going to fall, he did that, I think, because he was asked to make that prediction, so it would become true in a sense.
I'm not sure that he was asked to make that prediction.
Okay. You would know better.
No, I'm just...
Yeah, I know.
I feel quite certain he was probably not asked to make that prediction.
Okay.
There were certainly others at the time who were not making that prediction, but I think the point is, look, I understand the issue you're raising. The issue you're raising is the U.S. strategy towards ISIS right now has put a premium on focusing on ISIS and has not put a premium on focusing on the radical Islamist threats that may exist. I still think this is an issue that is still probably something to be sorted out on our side. We have a strategy towards ISIS in Iraq that is very clear. We have a strategy towards ISIS in Syria that is not so clear. And that is something that, as I said, I mean, this is something that over time I think is still part of a strategy that has to become more developed. If we are going to succeed against ISIS, we can't have a containment strategy within Syria. We're going to have a different approach. That's not the topic of this panel, but I think the topic of this panel is America in decline in this region, or is the United States somehow withdrawing from this region? And the fact is, for all the talk of pivots, the fact is we don't exactly look like we're pivoting out of the Middle East right now. You know, you made the statement, or somebody made the statement, the U.S. out of Iraq. No, we're not out of Iraq. We have close to 3,000 military personnel on the ground in Iraq. Not to mention we are carrying out daily sorties in Iraq. It may not be the level of activism that some people suggest it should be, and it may also reflect that this is an increasingly difficult region to try to manage at this point. I see the prospect of the United States withdrawing from this region very slight. And the reason is very simple. The larger the threat with failing and failed states, the greater the potential for groups like ISIS to have operational space in which to be moving. The more they operate, the more these types of groups exist, the more they ultimately represent a threat to the homeland of the United States. We will not withdraw out of the region because of that, though there's no great appetite for us to get into land wars here. Having said that, I said, we have the President of the United States now pushing for new authorization for the use of force for us to replace the existing authorization. There is a term of art in here about not having enduring offensive operations, which is another way of saying we will still have some ground presence. even in places that maybe we don't want. We are not about to withdraw. We still have military forces that nobody else has, and yet we have at the same time certain common interests. When it comes to counterterror, this is a common interest. It's not a different interest. Where we differ with the Russians right now on Syria is that ultimately we think that Assad's presence is a magnet for every jihadi worldwide, and as long as he's there, that's going to be the case. But we don't have an answer for Syria today, and that's something that we have to try to come up with. So I think some of the inherent conflict that may exist is going to be reduced the more the focal point is counterterror, because this is a common interest, it's not a competing interest.
I want to ask, we're nearing time end, and I know that Ephraim is looking at me and he's worried about that, but you know, we're gonna slightly go overboard, because I want to hear you, Vice Ambassador Drobinin. Do you think it's possible for Russia to build today partnerships in this region, strategic partnerships, which will, you know, Vikram Sood mentioned China using Russia as a front, or even having a partnership with China, which would be, for instance, towards the Syrian issue or towards the Iranian nuclear issue, which would be very specific, not a general partnership, not an alliance, but it will go to strengthen its interest in these issues, and its interests are not the same as the interests of the United States. Because we're not talking here about counterterrorism, but about different issues. Regime change, Iran nuclear or not nuclear, what to do if negotiations fail, and so forth.
Well, thank you very much. I will try to be concise. First of all, let me just say that I agree completely with Dr. Ross that a policy of any major power towards the region is not built only on counter-terror or security considerations. There is a much wider range of considerations and interests, including economy, humanitarian, energy, and, you know, this is an environment that a political leadership has to take its decisions. Now, as for strategic partnerships, as you put it, with China or with anybody else, first of all, let me tell you that it is really difficult to use Russia against its interests. Yeah. So it's not going to be used by anyone, not China, not the United States, but it will take its decisions according to its own considerations. So now what we see now with regard to Syria or Iran, again focusing on those very two specific issues, because, you know, there are a lot of other issues and the situation is much more multifaceted in the region. Along the events of the last 2 and 3 years, Russia and China have cooperated closely in the Security Council on Syria, trying to prevent an adoption of a decision that would allow to launch a legitimate outside intervention, military intervention in that country. We hope that this page has been turned over and a major effort is going to be undertaken for a political settlement of the crisis in Syria. Russia is trying to make its contribution by holding discussions of Syrian opposition groups with representatives of the government in Moscow. As for Iran, I think this is an even more complicated picture, and one of the venues where Russia, China, the United States and the 3 European countries are cooperating very closely with a view first to give Iran its right to develop nuclear power for peaceful purposes, and also guaranteeing, making sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. So this is a very complicated picture, and I think the best way to deal with the situation is to avoid oversimplifications.
Okay, there's a lady there putting signs, threatening signs to me that I should end the panel right now and go to Ephraim. Madam, gentlemen, thank you so much. Ephraim, please.
I just want to make two short comments, and I apologize for speaking in Hebrew before. I didn't realize that the panel members didn't have translation. Two comments. One, I raise a question to what extent we have to expect that the United States will perhaps lower its profile in the Middle East, facing all the difficulties and problems and expectations in the Middle East. My answer is negative. I don't think it can happen. I'm saying that for twofold reasons. One, the Middle East has become the most unstable region around the world. And this instability is not limited to the Middle East. It goes much beyond the Middle East. It goes to Europe and to some extent to the United States. And I think the United States cannot allow itself to ignore these new difficulties and dangers. And if you try to escape from the Middle East will run after you. And secondly, many of the leaders of the Middle East, many of them are allies of the United States, not only Israel, are too weak to handle these problems, to cope with these difficulties. And therefore, they need the United States. Without the United States, Kuwait probably would be under Iraqi rule until today. Without the United States, nobody could lead the struggle against ISIS and so on and so forth. I think for these two reasons, and some other reasons that I don't have the time to refer to, I think I do not expect the United States to significantly lower its profile in the Middle East. Secondly and lastly, implications for Israel. I mentioned one implication. During the last year and a half, there are growing tensions between Egypt and the United States. And Egypt is one of the best allies of the United States in the Middle East. I won't refer to the reasons for these tensions. But anyway, for the last year and a half, under President Sisi, Egypt is speaking explicitly about changing the balance of its relations with the United States on one hand and other countries, other governments, especially Russia, on the other hand. The question is to what extent it can refer to Israel. And I would say during the last 25 years, Israel has improved significantly its relations with the countries that we are representing here, with Russia, with China, with India. And sometimes you hear some voices in Israel saying that perhaps we don't have to put all the eggs in one basket, the American basket, and we have to change the balance of our relations between the United States and other governments. I would say whatever it happened, and with all the importance of these relations with other countries, there is no alternative to the strategic relations between Israel and the United States. We'll have to continue and rely on the United States despite all the difficulties and controversies which emerge from time to time. Thank you very much.